I didn't know the morning my husband's inheritance would be discussed would begin with a stranger warning me that someone in my own family was about to take everything from me. The man appeared just as I was opening the driver's door of my silver Honda parked outside my small brick house in Columbus, Ohio. His coat was worn and a little too thin for the chilly spring air, but his eyes were sharp, almost careful, as if he had been waiting for the right moment to speak. "Ma'am," he said quietly, stepping closer but keeping a respectful distance, "your daughter-in-law is about to steal everything." The words hung in the air like cold fog. For a second I thought I had misheard him. People sometimes say strange things in parking lots. But something about the way he said it made me pause with my keys still in my hand. I studied his face, trying to understand why a complete stranger would say something like that to me on a morning that already carried too much weight. My husband, Daniel, had passed away 3 months earlier after 42 years of marriage. He had been the kind of man who kept careful records and labeled every folder in his office with neat blue ink. The meeting I was heading to that morning was supposed to be simple. The lawyer would read the final documents and explain how Daniel wanted his savings, his small investment accounts, and our house divided. I had expected a quiet conversation, maybe an hour at most. Our son had died years earlier in a car accident, leaving his wife Lindsay as the only younger member of the family. I believe Daniel had made sure everyone would be treated fairly. At least that was what he told me during those quiet evenings when we sat on the porch watching the sun fall behind the maple trees across the street. The stranger shifted his weight and glanced toward the road as if nervous someone might hear him. "I'm not asking you for money," he added quickly, almost defensively. "I just thought you should know." His voice carried the kind of seriousness that makes a person stop pretending everything is normal. I closed the car door slowly and looked at him again. "Why would you say that?" I asked. He hesitated. For a moment I thought he might walk away. Instead he lowered his voice even more. "Because I saw something a few weeks ago. Something that didn't look right." Before I could ask another question, a car passed by and he stepped back toward the sidewalk. "You should go to your meeting," he said quietly. "Just pay attention to what they read." Then he turned and walked down the block, disappearing past the corner grocery store as if he had never been there at all. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment staring at the steering wheel. The dashboard clock read 9:12 a.m. My meeting with the attorney was at 9:30. 20 minutes later I would sit across from a polished oak table while Lindsay Collins smiled calmly beside the lawyer. And when the new will was finally read aloud, I would hear something that made that stranger's warning echo in my mind like a bell I could not silence. I parked outside the law office 10 minutes later. But I did not step out of the car right away. The engine was still running and the heater hummed softly, yet the stranger's words kept circling in my mind. "Your daughter-in-law is about to steal everything." It sounded dramatic, almost ridiculous, and yet something about the certainty in his voice refused to fade. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment watching people walk past the windows of the building. The office belonged to Harold Benton, a quiet attorney who had handled my husband Daniel's paperwork for more than 15 years. Daniel trusted him completely. That alone should have comforted me. But the strange encounter outside my house had left a small crack in my sense of calm. When I finally stepped inside the building, the smell of fresh coffee and polished wood greeted me. The receptionist recognized me and offered a polite smile before guiding me down the hallway to the conference room. Lindsay was already there. She was sitting upright in a leather chair with her hands folded neatly in front of her, dressed in a light gray blazer that looked far more formal than the occasion required. She greeted me warmly, almost too warmly, with the careful tone people use when they believe they are about to receive good news. I noticed the way she kept glancing toward the stack of papers in front of Mr. Benton as he organized the documents. On the table, Harold cleared his throat and began explaining that Daniel had updated certain legal instructions shortly before his passing. His voice was steady and professional, but I felt my attention narrowing with every sentence he spoke. When he finally began reading the official will, I listened carefully, waiting to hear the familiar structure Daniel had once described to me during a quiet evening at home. Instead, the words moved in a direction that made my chest tighten. The house, the investment accounts, even the retirement savings Daniel had spent decades building were being transferred entirely to Lindsay. My name did not appear anywhere except in a short line granting me temporary residence rights for 6 months. 6 months. That was all. For a moment I wondered if there had been some mistake in the paperwork. Daniel had always been methodical and fair. He believed deeply that family should be protected, especially after loss. I looked across the table at Lindsay, hoping to see confusion or surprise on her face, but she simply maintained a calm expression that looked almost rehearsed. She nodded slowly as Harold finished reading the document, as if everything unfolding in that room had already been expected. I did not interrupt. I did not raise my voice. Instead I sat quietly and listened to the final page being turned. The stranger's warning returned to my mind again, sharper this time. Pay attention to what they read. When the lawyer finished, he placed the papers down carefully and asked if anyone had questions. Lindsay was the first to speak, thanking him politely and commenting that Daniel must have changed the document during his final hospital stay because he wanted things to be simple. That explanation sounded smooth and reasonable to anyone hearing it for the first time. But something about the timing did not fit. I remembered the last week Daniel spent in the hospital clearly. He had been weak, heavily medicated, and barely able to hold a pen. As I sat there looking at the document that had quietly erased me from a life I helped build, a quiet thought began forming in the back of my mind. Perhaps the stranger outside my house had not been mistaken after all. I did not speak immediately after the lawyer finished reading the document. I simply nodded slowly, the same way people do when they are trying to understand something that does not quite make sense yet. The room felt unusually quiet, even though the city traffic outside the window continued moving as it always did. Harold Benton carefully stacked the papers in front of him, adjusting the corners until they were perfectly aligned. Lindsay leaned back slightly in her chair, crossing one leg over the other with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed the difficult part of the day was already over. I studied her face without letting my expression change. For years I had watched Lindsay in small family moments, birthday dinners, Thanksgiving afternoons, and quiet Sunday visits. She was always very careful about how she appeared to others. Calm, polite, thoughtful. But there were small details that sometimes slipped through when people were not paying attention. A quick glance when money was mentioned. A certain tone when she talked about long-term plans. Those details returned to my mind now like puzzle pieces sliding slowly into place. Harold asked if everything was clear regarding the terms of the document. His voice remained neutral, the way a professional voice often does when it expects routine confirmation. I told him that I understood what had been read. I even thanked him for explaining it so clearly. That seemed to surprise Lindsay slightly. I could see the brief flicker in her eyes, as if she had prepared herself for a stronger reaction. But I had learned something important during my 42 years with Daniel. When a situation feels wrong, silence often reveals more than anger ever could. The meeting ended quickly after that. Harold gathered the documents and mentioned that copies would be provided once the filing process was completed. Lindsay stood and adjusted her jacket, offering me a sympathetic smile that looked carefully practiced. She placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, and said Daniel must have wanted things to be simple after everything our family had already endured. I nodded again, thanking her for her concern. If she noticed the distance in my voice, she did not mention it. A few minutes later we walked out of the building together. The morning sun reflected off the parked cars along the street, and people moved past us carrying coffee cups and office bags as if it were just another ordinary weekday. Lindsay said she had another appointment and would call me later in the week to discuss practical details about the house. I told her that sounded reasonable. She gave a small wave before walking toward her car, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. I watched her drive away before turning toward my own vehicle. The moment I reached the driver's door, I remembered the stranger again. The quiet man who had spoken to me outside my house that morning. Something about an envelope. Something that did not look right. The memory was no longer just a passing thought. It had become a question that demanded an answer. Instead of starting the car, I sat there thinking about the timeline Lindsay had mentioned. She said Daniel had signed the updated document during his final hospital stay. I could still picture that hospital room clearly. The machines beside his bed. The soft beeping sounds. The way his hands trembled whenever he tried to lift a glass of water. Daniel had not been able to hold a pen steady during those last days. The realization settled over me slowly but firmly. If Daniel could not sign anything that week, Then someone else must have made sure the document looked as if he had. And suddenly the stranger's warning no longer sounded strange at all. I remained in the parking lot longer than I expected. The steering wheel felt cool beneath my hands, and the quiet inside the car allowed my thoughts to settle in a way they could not inside the conference room. Daniel had always believed that small details mattered. He used to say that if something important did not make sense the first time, it was worth looking at a second time. That idea stayed with me as I started the engine and slowly drove away from the law office. Instead of heading straight home, I turned toward the street that passed near the small grocery store a few blocks away. The same corner where the stranger had disappeared earlier that morning. I did not know exactly what I expected to find there. Perhaps nothing at all. But the calm certainty in his voice had stayed with me, and ignoring it would have felt like walking away from a question that deserved an answer. When I reached the corner, I parked along the curb and stepped out. The neighborhood looked ordinary, the way it always did on weekday mornings. A delivery truck was parked outside the grocery store, and a few people walked in and out carrying paper bags. For a moment I wondered if the man had already moved on, like so many people do when they live without a permanent place to stay. I began walking slowly along the sidewalk, scanning the benches and the shaded spots near the buildings. Then I noticed him sitting near the edge of a bus stop bench about half a block away. The same worn coat, the same careful posture. When he saw me approaching, he straightened slightly as if he had been expecting that I might come looking for him. I stopped a few feet away and studied his expression. There was no sign of impatience or fear, only a quiet seriousness that made the moment feel strangely calm. I told him the meeting had already happened. I told him what the lawyer had read from the document. He listened without interrupting, his hands folded loosely together. When I finished speaking, he nodded slowly as if the outcome had not surprised him at all. Then he said something that made the air around us feel suddenly heavier. He said he had been sitting near the law office late one evening about 3 weeks earlier when a woman had approached him with a small envelope. She had asked him to deliver it to the building's night mailbox and promised him $50 if he did not ask any questions. He described the woman carefully, the color of her jacket, the way she kept checking the street before handing him the envelope. He said he did not recognize her at first, but later that night he saw the same woman again when she returned to the office parking lot with a man who appeared to be an attorney. The lights inside the office were on even though the building was supposed to be closed. As he spoke, each detail settled into my mind with quiet clarity. When he finally described the woman's face, there was no longer any doubt about who he had seen standing in that parking lot. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. The traffic light at the corner changed from red to green and a bus rolled past, but the sound felt distant, as if the world had moved a few steps away from where we were standing. I asked him to repeat the description one more time slowly, just to be certain I had not misunderstood. He did. The jacket was light gray. The woman was about 35, maybe a little younger. Her hair was pulled back in a tight style, the way someone does when they want to look professional. And the voice, he said, was calm but impatient, like someone who expected the task to be completed quickly. Each detail matched Lindsay's so closely that it almost felt unnecessary to confirm it. Still, I let him finish speaking before responding. I asked him if he remembered the exact night this happened. He thought for a moment and then said it was the same week the city had its early spring rainstorm, the one that flooded the parking lot behind the grocery store for a few hours. I remembered that storm clearly. It had happened 2 days before Daniel was transferred from the hospital to the hospice care center. During that week he had barely been able to stay awake for more than a few minutes at a time. Holding a pen had been nearly impossible for him. I thanked the man for telling me what he saw. He shrugged slightly, as if the situation did not belong to him anymore now that the information had been shared. Then he said something else that made the picture even clearer. When he returned to the law office mailbox to deliver the envelope, he noticed it was not sealed the way most letters are. The flap had been folded loosely. Curiosity had made him glance inside before sliding it through the slot. He admitted he only looked for a second, but it was long enough to see a printed document with several signature lines near the bottom. At the time he had assumed it was just another legal form. Now, after hearing about the meeting that morning, he believed it might have been something more important. I asked him if he would be willing to repeat what he had told me if someone asked about it later. He looked thoughtful for a moment, then nodded. He said he did not enjoy being part of other people's problems, but he believed that if something dishonest had happened, someone should say so. I reached into my purse and offered him some money for his time, but he shook his head and stepped back slightly. He told me he had not shared the story for that reason. Then he gathered his things and walked toward the bus stop bench again, leaving me standing on the sidewalk with a quiet certainty forming in my mind. The document read that morning inside Harold Benton's office might have looked official, but every detail now pointed toward a different truth. Daniel had not changed his will during his final days. Someone had simply made sure it appeared that he had. I stood there for a long moment after the man finished speaking, watching the steady movement of cars passing through the intersection. The world around me continued as if nothing unusual had happened, yet something inside my mind had shifted quietly into place. For the first time since Daniel passed away, the confusion that had surrounded the inheritance meeting began to feel less like a mystery and more like a pattern. Small details, quiet actions, moments that seemed ordinary at first but now carried a different meaning when placed together. I thanked the man again before returning to my car. As I drove home, I kept replaying the timeline in my head. The storm he mentioned had arrived on a Tuesday evening. That same night Lindsay had called me to say she was stopping by the hospital to bring Daniel a change of clothes and some paperwork the nurses had requested. At the time I had been grateful that she offered to help. I had been exhausted from spending most of the day sitting beside Daniel's bed, listening to the steady rhythm of the monitors while doctors quietly discussed the next stage of his care. Now that memory returned with a different weight. When I reached the house, the familiar shape of the front porch felt strangely quiet without Daniel sitting there in his old wooden chair. I stepped inside and walked slowly through the living room, past the shelves where he used to keep his neatly labeled folders. Daniel had always believed that if something was important it should be organized clearly enough for anyone to understand later. That habit had once made me smile. Now it gave me an idea. I walked to the small office at the back of the house and opened the cabinet where he stored his personal records. Inside were folders arranged by year, each one marked in the same careful handwriting. I pulled out the folder labeled estate planning. The original documents were still there, along with copies of letters Daniel had exchanged with Harold Benton over the years. I sat at the desk and began reading slowly. The will Daniel described in those papers was not the one that had been read that morning. In fact, the version he discussed placed the house in my name completely and divided the financial accounts between me and a small educational trust Daniel had created years earlier in memory of our son. Lindsay's name appeared only as a secondary beneficiary if something ever happened to me. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the silence of the room settle around me. If the original plan had been this clear, then the document presented at the meeting could only exist for one reason. Someone had replaced it. I opened my eyes again and looked at the folder resting on the desk. Daniel had always trusted that people close to him would respect the work he spent decades building. But trust, I realized, can sometimes be the very thing that allows someone else to take advantage of it quietly. The stranger at the bus stop had not solved the problem completely, but he had revealed the first thread. And once you find the first thread in a tangled story, it becomes much easier to start pulling the rest of it into the light. I sat at Daniel's desk until the late afternoon light stretched across the floor in long quiet lines. The folder remained open in front of me, and the more I read through the original documents, the more certain I became that the will presented that morning did not match the plans Daniel had carefully prepared over the years. He had never been careless with legal matters. Every paper in that cabinet had been dated, copied, and filed with the same steady patience he used in every other part of his life. That consistency was exactly what allowed the difference to stand out now. The document Harold Benton read earlier that day carried the same heading and formatting, but the distribution of the estate had been altered completely. Someone had replaced Daniel's intentions with a version that placed nearly everything in Lindsay's control. I closed the folder slowly and rested my hands on the desk. Anger did not arrive the way people imagine it does in dramatic stories. It arrived quietly, like a decision forming step by step. Daniel had spent 42 years building a life that was meant to provide stability long after he was gone. I was not going to allow someone to quietly rewrite that story without question. Instead of calling Lindsay or confronting anyone directly, I reached for the phone and began searching for another attorney in Columbus who specialized in estate disputes. Within an hour I found the name of a woman called Patricia Morgan, a lawyer known for reviewing contested wills and financial irregularities. Her office was across town near the courthouse. When I called, her assistant scheduled a consultation for the following morning. That evening I prepared carefully. I gathered the original estate planning folder Daniel had kept in the cabinet along with several letters he had exchanged with Harold Benton during the previous year. I also wrote down everything the man at the bus stop had told me, including the night of the rainstorm and the description of the envelope he had delivered to the law office mailbox. By the time the sun had set and the kitchen clock moved past 9, the pieces of the situation felt less scattered. They had begun to form a clear direction. The next morning I drove across the city to Patricia Morgan's office. Her building overlooked the courthouse square, and the windows of her conference room faced the long steps where people arrived for hearings every day. Patricia listened carefully while I explained what had happened during the inheritance meeting. She did not interrupt, but she took notes steadily as I described the stranger's account and the documents I had discovered at home. When I finished, she studied the folder for several minutes before speaking. She said something that confirmed what my instincts had already begun to suspect. If Daniel had been too weak to sign a new will during his final days, and if the original documents clearly stated different instructions, then the version read in Harold Benton's office deserved a much closer examination. Patricia closed the folder and looked at me calmly. She said that sometimes the truth about a document only appears when the right questions are asked in the right place. And she assured me that she knew exactly where those questions needed to be asked. I left Patricia Morgan's office that morning with a feeling I had not experienced since the day of the inheritance meeting. It was not relief exactly, and it was not anger either. It was something steadier than both of those emotions. It was certainty. Patricia had spent nearly an hour examining the documents Daniel kept in his estate planning folder, comparing the dates, the formatting, and the notes he had written in the margins of several letters. She explained that people often believe a will becomes unquestionable once it is read in a law office, but the truth is far more complicated. Every legal document leaves a trail behind it. Signatures must match previous records. Filing times must align with the timeline of the person who signed them. Witnesses must confirm that they saw the signature happen under proper conditions. If any part of that chain is weak, the entire document can be challenged. As she spoke, she circled several details on a notepad. The date of the supposed signature during Daniel's hospital stay. The time the document was officially filed with the county clerk. The name of the attorney who submitted it. One detail in particular made her pause. The document had been filed very late in the evening on the same night. The stranger at the bus stop described delivering the envelope to the law office mailbox. Patricia looked up from her notes and explained that law offices rarely file estate documents that late unless something unusual is happening. Then she asked a simple question that immediately changed the direction of everything. She asked whether Harold Benton himself had been present in the office that night. I realized I did not know the answer. Patricia nodded thoughtfully and said that was exactly the kind of detail that deserved careful investigation. Over the next several days she began contacting the county clerk's office and requesting copies of the official filing records. She also arranged for a handwriting specialist to compare the signature on the new document with Daniel's verified signatures from earlier financial records. Meanwhile, I continued gathering small pieces of information that once seemed unimportant. I found an old calendar Daniel kept on the kitchen counter where he wrote down his appointments in neat blue ink. The week of the rainstorm showed only hospital visits and medical consultations. There was no note about signing legal papers. Also spoke again with the man who had delivered the envelope. He agreed to write down exactly what he remembered and sign a statement confirming the time and place he had seen the woman at the law office. Each detail added another thread to the growing picture. A week later Patricia called and asked me to come back to her office. When I arrived she had several documents spread across the conference table. The county filing record showed that the will presented during the inheritance meeting had been officially submitted just 40 minutes after the envelope was delivered to the building mailbox. The timing was too precise to ignore. Patricia rested her hand on the table and explained that the next step would be confronting the people involved. And when she said that, I already knew exactly whose name would be spoken first. I arrived at Patricia Morgan's office the following Tuesday morning knowing that the quiet stage of the investigation was ending. The conference room table looked very different from the first time I had sat there. Instead of a single folder, several carefully organized stacks of documents now covered the surface. Patricia had placed colored tabs along the edges so each piece of evidence could be explained clearly. The filing record from the county clerk rested beside the handwriting comparison report, and next to those were the written statement from the man who delivered the envelope and copies of Daniel's original estate planning letters. Patricia greeted me with the calm confidence of someone who had already reviewed every possible outcome. She explained that the handwriting specialist had completed the analysis the previous evening. The signature on the newly filed will shared some surface similarities with Daniel's earlier signatures, but the underlying stroke patterns were inconsistent with the way he normally formed several letters in his name. According to the report, the signature appeared to have been carefully copied rather than written naturally. That detail alone raised serious questions about the legitimacy of the document. But Patricia explained that the timeline made the situation even more significant. The hospital records confirmed that during the exact hour the will was supposedly signed, Daniel had been under medical supervision and receiving treatment that made it extremely unlikely he could have reviewed or signed legal paperwork. Patricia folded her hands on the table and said something that made the entire situation feel suddenly clear. When a questionable document is supported by a weak timeline and an uncertain signature, the court does not simply accept it at face value. It demands explanations. That was when she revealed the next step she had already arranged. A formal challenge had been filed requesting a review hearing before the probate judge. Harold Benton would be required to present the circumstances under which the new will appeared, including who brought the document into his office and how it was verified before being submitted to the county clerk. As she spoke, I could already picture how the conversation would unfold once those questions were asked in a courtroom rather than a private office. Patricia also explained that Lindsay would likely be called to testify about her involvement during Daniel's final week in the hospital. The quiet confidence Lindsay displayed during the inheritance meeting would not carry the same weight once every detail was examined under oath. I sat back in the chair and looked at the documents spread across the table. Only a week earlier I had walked into that first meeting believing the situation was already decided. Now the truth was moving steadily toward the surface, guided by evidence Daniel himself had unknowingly left behind. Patricia gathered the folders neatly and placed them into a case file before standing to walk me to the door. She paused before I left and said something that stayed with me as I stepped out onto the courthouse square. She said that sometimes the people who believe they have planned everything perfectly forget one simple thing. The truth has a way of waiting patiently until the right moment to be heard. And very soon that moment was coming.